Welcome to the 11th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with lying and astroturf organisations instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. We'll have some fun and some gossip, and we'll ask some vital questions, like who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street. Matthew d'Ancona is an English journalist, and his official job is editor-at-large of the magazine/newspaper New World, which was called the New European until last week, when it got rebranded. His background and career look, at first, as rather conventionally super high-achieving, centre-right-ish. Independent school, modern history at Oxford, a first, a Times trainee in fast progression to the Sunday Telegraph, where, and I absolutely wasn't reading it at the time, he wrote a column that was described as the best insight into Cameronism, whatever that was. And then, and this seemed like an orderly progression at the time, he became editor of the Spectator, succeeding Boris Johnson from 2006 to late 2009 to be replaced by Fraser Nelson. I'm not quite sure what happened after that, but in 2015 he re-emerged as a weekly columnist for The Guardian. Now, that's a bit of a jump, but not inconceivable, and The Guardian's a broadish church. And the Sunday Telegraph then wasn't what it is now under Alistair, spelt T-E-R, Alistair Heath. Then he started writing some very interesting books, starting with a history of the coalition. And then in 2017 he wrote Post-Truth, an important book about the new global war on reality. And in 2021, Identity, Ignorance and Innovation, a sort of personal manifesto about why the old politics is useless and what to do about it, and where he described himself as a liberal. What got me reading him was a piece he wrote in 2019 for the slow news platform Tortoise, where he was a founding editor. It was called Bannon's Britain, and it explained how, behind the flummery of Parliament and the institutions, the British right was now part of an international network driven by people like Steve Bannon and connected online. It was about personal connections and working in a different way. This was the modern world, and I cited it to everyone. Now, Matthew, good morning. If you look at your impressive writing career, there are some oddities which might be clues to the later Matthew. I've left out the fact that your first job was at the very liberal, lefty-seeming Index on Censorship, not in SW1, but Highbury.
That's right.
In British North London.
Its offices were up there. I'd decided to stop my researches in Oxford because I don't think that medieval history or I would have benefited with the continued alliance. And I got drawn into, first of all, being just a researcher at Index on Censorship, because I've always been very interested in the whole cause of dissent and free speech. And it was a wonderful time. And then I was lucky enough, as you mentioned, to go to the Times. But it's certainly true that it was a formative period for me, both because I knew the minute I walked into it was the office at the top of a beautiful Highbury house in those days, just one room. And I loved the journalistic atmosphere immediately. And it was a wonderful group of people. And although you're right, Peter, that I guess there was a lefty liberal tilt to it. It was a time when free speech was not really defined by ideology. So there's a perception, I think, at the moment that free speech is sort of not totally a right-wing issue, but it's become associated with, white men of power. In those days, it was a coalition. And so, you were as likely to have late Roger Scruton involved in things that they were doing, as you were some left-wing luminary. Arthur Miller was very supportive to them. And, so it was the whole thing was built on this idea that the post-Second World War order had to be built on liberties about which we all agreed. And of course, the world has changed a lot. I hadn't really thought about it in the way that you described about the timing of. I left the Spectator in 2009. And actually, what happened after that was I carried on writing a weekly column for the Sunday Telegraph. And also, I started doing a column for the Evening Standard, which was edited by Geordie Gregg. And I joined the Guardian, as you said, in 2015. But the interesting thing about those years, and I'd never really linked it up, but what you said just sort of put a light bulb on my head, was that I sort of left the Spectator when the world was falling apart. You know, the financial crash had happened. It was clear that the centre-right mission that was just about to start had already, under Cameron, had a fatal flaw in it, which was that there was this huge financial dislocation going on. And then that led to the rise, which I was initially dismissive of, and shame on me, of Brexitism, and also what Brexitism was symbolic of, which was this kind of belief in a disenfranchised, deindustrialized, forgotten half of society. And during that time, politics became polarized, hardened. And I suddenly found that the political world in which I'd been brought up, which was post-Cold War, the Conservatives had been in power for a long time, under Thatcher and Major. And then there was a new, moderate, left of centre alternative coming up with Clinton and Blair and so on that replaced it. And this was sort of end of history times, which is, you know, rightly mocked now. But at the time, that it was very infectious as a move, that something very important and transformative has happened. Of course, it was, in fact, the death rattle of something. So if you go back to the 2009 to 2015 period, I think during that period, I realized that if I had to pick a side in this, it wasn't going to be based on party lines. It was going to be based on, well, I definitely want Britain to stay in the EU. I hadn't until that point been a sort of raging EU file. I thought there was plenty wrong with Brussels, but it never occurred to me that there would be a serious prospect of the UK leaving, and suddenly there was. And also, and this speaks to the theme of your excellent podcast, is that there was as Andrew Breitbart famously said, and I don't know if he was quoting someone like Gramsci or whatever, but you know that suddenly politics was downstream from culture. And this really made me think quite hard, and I'm still thinking quite hard all these years later about what that means. But it really wasn't the political and journalistic world I'd grown up in. And I sort of set my face to trying to understand it, because it did seem to me that the world I'd grown up in had passed. The old order had gone, but the new order hadn't yet revealed itself. And so those books you very kindly mentioned, I mean, I'd known so many of the protagonists in the coalition, and it was a very busy period that it seemed silly not to write a book about it. So I did. But then it was clear that huge thematic issues were proposing themselves. So post-truth was one, and that was in the immediate aftermath of Brexit and Trump's first election. And then the third book you mentioned, Identity, Ignorance, Innovation, well, I'm very glad you see it as a personal manifesto. It was written at great speed in the pandemic. And so it has something of the quality of a fever dream about it, in that it was a time when everything felt like a compacted nerve. And there were all these things going on. And when I look back on it now, it almost reads like a journal entry with a few footnotes. You know, it's kind of what I was trying to capture at that moment was that the extraordinary intensity of 2020, 2021. And so I look back on it now and a lot has changed, but I don't resile from the central ideas in it.
What you do in there, and at first it was surprising to me, is you mount a very spirited defense of identity politics.
So remember the context. We had the hashtag #MeToo movement. The environmental movement had mutated into something much more intense and personalized, especially for young people. And of course, the big event was the horrendous murder of George Floyd in 2020 and the consequent Black Lives Matter movement building up all over the world, not just in America. And it seemed to me that there was a a false antithesis in this, that either you embraced absolutely all of it and you swallowed it down like, one great gulp of ideological medicine, or you opposed it all as a unconscionable menace to the liberal order. And I thought, well, hold on a second, let's actually look what's going on here. And it seemed to me that, you mentioned that I self-identify as a liberal, and I suppose I do still.
You said it. You actually used those words several times over.
No, I mean, that's what I am, and as much as I sort of oscillate over the line, it's what I always come back to. But yeah, liberalism is not, God's last word to the planet, in the sense that what it seemed to me was really, really important about, and especially Me Too and BLM had in common, is what was going on in both of these movements was that in the first instance, women were saying, you liberals, you believers in universal rights, been banging on about how well your system and your legal system works. Well, it doesn't. And this is why we've had to take recourse to using the press, using social media, outing sexual assaults and so on. And the same thing, it seemed to me, was true of BLM, which was you had people of color saying, look, we've been listening for centuries to moderate white people saying, just be patient, it'll all be fine.
Hang on.
And, just be cut, I mean, as James Baldwin said, how long exactly do I have to wait?
Yeah.
And we keep being shot or killed by policemen in judicial executions. So do you understand why we're angry? And it seemed to me that in both those movements, there was a justified reproach to traditional liberalism and a big fat message to be taken on board. And I still think that. The twist was that I felt that some of the people who were promoting identity politics got too hung up on issues about who was allowed to speak about what, speech codes, deplatforming. And it felt a bit like a football match where the teams are stuck in the dressing room for 3 hours arguing about the offside rule, and there wasn't enough actually getting on the pitch. And I think that was the fatal flaw in that phase of identity politics, which was too much, you can't speak about this, you can't speak at all, you should lose your job, all that sort of stuff, and not enough on, well, what are the actual, I mean, I'll never forget, and it played a very important part in that book, hearing David Lammy, now Foreign Secretary, but not then, on the Today programme, listing all the multiple reports that had been written up about various aspects of the bad treatment in this country of people of colour. And his simple mantra, his refrain during the interview, I think it was still with John Humphreys, was implement them. In other words, if this movement means anything, it has to be about practicality and not performance. Yeah. And I think that was absolutely spot on. So that was my kind of attempt to square the circle. I'm not sure how many people it persuaded, but that I still think that. I don't think, now that Trump is back, there's been what people insist on calling a vibe shift against DEI, so-called wokeness and everything. And I think that's silly too, the idea that all this is now in the past is ridiculous.
Because they are all the gains from the 1960s onwards.
Yes.
As it were.
Yes, I mean,
for each group of people.
I mean, and one can get too stuck on the American example, but I was reading yesterday that Pete Hegseth, the deranged defense secretary in America, has insisted that Harvey Milk, the first, I think, openly gay elected official in America who was gunned down, there's a naval ship named after him. And Hegseth has insisted that the ship's name be changed because this is not manly, this is not consistent with the MAGA concept of virility. And I think that's truly appalling, where you're openly, explicitly, and without apology saying we're rolling back the gains of the last years. And that is very sad, I think.
There's a great question now for British and European reporters, how to describe what's going on in America domestically.
Yes.
Forget the thing about tariffs and all that attention-seeking stuff. that could stop tomorrow with a change. The other stuff seems to have gone really rather far.
Yes.
Like the thing you've described, which goes beyond the great debate or the intended split in LGBT, cut off the T, down to what you're saying, I didn't know this about the ship. But that goes back well into the 60s and all the gains of the 60s.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not just trying to turn back the clock on the last 10 or 20 years at all. It's trying to turn back. You're right. Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News, said that everything went wrong in 1965. And I think that tells you a lot about the mindset of what became MAGA. But how to report America now is domestically is extremely hard. You're right, Peter, because we've all grown up in an era where the presidency has a tremendous authority, whoever occupies it. And there's a sort of stateliness, or has been, about American politics, and an assumption that the Constitution, however it's sometimes ignored, it remains the core of American domestic politics. And that is no longer safe.
No.
And the two things that I think are the two principal domestic fronts where I think this is most visible are obviously the way in which Trump and his cohorts are weaponizing mass deportation in ways that are clearly unlawful and to a certain extent are still snarled up in the courts as a kind of blunt force trauma. I mean, it's not just that he wants to get undocumented migrants out of the US. I think he also wants to administer a shock therapy to American society that explains to them they now live in a police state by any other name. So that's one front. The second front is less reported, but I suspect just as important, and that's the culture war, which is taking over the Kennedy Center and insisting that Les Miserables is shown, and taking over the Library of Congress, and taking enormous steps to decide what is taught at universities and by whom. I mean, these are Putin's famous line that wars are won by teachers, not soldiers. This is really, really dark stuff. And I think that both of them make it very difficult for British and European journalists who've been used to a certain way of covering America to understand that there is no pendulum. Whatever comes next will not necessarily be worse, but there's no reason to assume that it's going to be better. And so just reporting Trump as a sort of malignant aberration, well, he's certainly malignant, but it may unfortunately not be an aberration. And we need to report him on his own terms. And also, you're kind enough to mention the piece on Bannon's network. Look at how he operates, because his style of politics is extremely new. It's hyper modern. It's not, it uses nostalgia very aggressively, but the way it works is through networks and through this very aggressive use of social media and imagery and spectacle, and a sort of very close linkage between politics and popular culture. When Trump turns up at a UFC mixed martial arts night on a Saturday night in New York, that's very important to the way he presents himself to the American people.
I've been talking, not extensively, but to a few people, Brits by citizenship, who work in America in universities, and they are terrified.
I bet.
Literally terrified. Terrified of coming back here in case they're not let back in. Terrified of losing their contracts, terrified of absolutely everything. And obviously, I'm talking about people who work in social sciences or liberal arts, etc. They're not doing brain chemistry. But I think if you were to talk to people who are doing brain chemistry, they'd feel a bit nervous too.
Well, they would, because we are seeing in the sort of gutting of research grants to aspects of science that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. doesn't approve of, or Trump's place people at the National Institutes of Health, so on, don't approve of, aren't getting money. So actually, you're right that the most obvious consequences are being felt by people who teach the humanities and things that Trump hates, like books. But also, this will have major consequences for, research requires long-term funding if it's going to work. You can't do oncological research on the basis of a one-year grant. It doesn't work. So this will make the life of serious scientists, researchers, medical investigators very hard. And I mean, I hope for them personally that a lot of them find work outside the United States. But obviously, I don't want the United States to, lose all its greatest experts.
Thinking about that, two stories which are very intertwined, Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder, both doing what one would call rather establishment posh things at Yale, and then both of them saying they're leaving and going to Canada, to University of Toronto, I think it is, because the progress in the stages of, now we have the big word, the stages of fascism, which Jason Stanley had written about before the pandemic.
Yep.
He had identified the various stages of fascism, drawing on history, doing all that stuff. And he was saying in American media, much interviewed, that America was getting there and he didn't plan to stay, particularly as in his case, he was a Jew married to a black woman and he had, as he put it, Jewish black children, and it wasn't going to be the ideal place for Jewish black children to grow up in.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned those two, Peter, because they're both such giants in their fields, which are connected but not identical. And the idea that either of them, let alone both, should feel, driven to leave America because of the inhospitable intellectual and cultural climate is so depressing. Both of them I've admired for many years. In fact, I was trying to make sense of what's been going on in Los Angeles over the last fortnight, and my first port of call was to Tim Schneider's brilliant books about, how the various steps of tyranny work. And it's, he's been, well, they both have, they've been fantastically prescient in laying out the sort of steps which unfortunately we're now quite well advanced on. One has to be really fair to them. Neither of them are remotely cowardly or lacking in courage. They're simply making understandable human decisions. And when people of that robustness and intellectual integrity realize that the time has come to split, something is really seriously up.
Now, they've been on every centrist, as one might call it, commercial centrist American platform. It's very easy to go to source now with American platforms because of things like YouTube. They've been everywhere saying this and using the two key words, A, fascist, and B, coup.
Yeah.
Now, there's a terrible reluctance to either platform them or use those words in this country. The BBC is very, very nervous about them and those words. Doesn't mean they've never had either of them on, but they're very careful about those words and the full story.
Well, it's an interesting point because I think the BBC sometimes it confuses impartiality with a sort of intellectual inelasticity, which is, yes, the BBC is charter bound to be impartial, but it is not charter bound to ignore that which is happening. I mean, quite the opposite. The purpose of the BBC, both domestically and in a way no less importantly globally, is to speak the truth. And the truth is changing, and it's changing at a velocity that I think the BBC and other big media organizations are struggling to keep up with. Because the problem is that enough people who are at senior roles in that organization and others, they probably weren't alive during the war, but they grew up with the idea of fascism being something that had been defeated. That was in the past. And this is sort of a cultural norm, isn't it? That you don't deploy words like fascist lightly.
Absolutely.
You don't debase the currency. The trouble is that you sometimes that's the right currency to use. And if you look at what Trump is doing, his fascism is not the same as Mussolini's or Hitler's or Franco's or even Pinochet's. It's a much more complex fascism, and it uses different channels and it uses different methods, but it is undoubtedly at minimum fascistic. And it uses, I suppose, the point that Trump is at the moment is what Daniel Levitsky calls competitive authoritarianism, which Russia has too, which is you have the notional formulae and procedures of democracy, elections and courts and so on, but they mean less and less. And I would say that's where we're at probably with America. I mean, his preposterous military parade, his appalling speech to young soldiers at Fort Bragg the other day, trying to turn the US armed services into a private militia. I mean, these are all hallmarks of fascistic behavior.
But do you think Waterston's man and woman, a lovely term, you've got a life, you're trying to keep up, you're trying to keep your family fed, you're not necessarily in London, let alone SW1, and you don't watch Newsnight every night as a commitment and so on and so forth. Do you think our media have adequately reported the situation in America so that Waterston's man and woman would have got the hang of what's really going on?
No. I mean, I hope we have it, what was the New European and is now the New World, but I would say that, wouldn't I? I do think that part of the problem is and I think this again goes back to the long tail of the 90s, is a kind of touching faith that at some point everything will just go back to normal. And partly this flows from people who came of age in the 90s, as did I, but also a sense that politics is essentially a branch of economics.
Yes.
And therefore, once economics all falls into place, whenever that moment may be judged to have come, we will smoothly revert to a soothing, sensible, technocratic centrism. And I just don't think that's how politics works anymore. I mean, there are technocratic centrist governments in the world. There's one in the UK at the moment. So that variety of government hasn't died. But what has died, and was probably never true, is the idea that it's the populists who are the aberration, and that at some point, by some imaginary force of inevitability, the pendulum will swing back to a place of comfort. And I think that it is the task of media sometimes to say this is a five-alarm fire. I mean, organizations like the BBC are notoriously and to some extent understandably reluctant to do that. But I mean, we've just passed the 10th anniversary of Trump coming down the golden escalator. We saw what his first presidency was like and how it ended on January the 6th. We now have very early in the second presidency, we have a very clear idea of where it's going. It really isn't premature to start using some fairly fruity language to describe it. I think there's a confusion of reticence with professionalism. It's not professional to gloss over things that are genuinely terrifying. It isn't.
So, you say the old UK politics is useless. There won't be a pendulum swing. So what should be done about it?
Well, I think that what has to be acknowledged is that all politics has always been performance. I mean, God's sake, anyone who knows about the history of Rome knows that. But performance is no longer just PR. I hear a lot of people saying, what Starmer needs is better comms. That's not what I mean at all. That every government from now on that wants to persuade the public to buy into it has to be performative in a way that actually centrist liberals find quite hard. Keir Starmer is someone for whom the theatre of politics is something from which he recoils. But we can't, unfortunately, you can't dictate the media environment in which you live, by which I mean in the broadest sense. And the left of centre politics of the future is going to have to be as personality driven, as spectacle driven, as populist in the broadest sense as its right wing forebears. The difference is it's got to be attached to a real benign message and a real benign set of policies. But we are going to have to change the way we do everything. I don't think you turn the clock back. And when I hear people saying, oh, what people really want is boring, I don't believe that for a minute. I mean, they have in their pockets a device which is ludicrously called a phone, which is essentially a dopamine machine. And the extent to which that machine feeds their habit, they are satisfied or not. Now, there may be changes to that, who knows, but I don't see them happening anytime soon.
I'm always very interested to hear extremely sophisticated, or at least socially sophisticated people defend Trump.
Yes.
People who might or might not have worked for the Spectator, for instance, and they say, look, there are some things about Trump that actually people like you might find a bit distasteful. Like, you might not like his flat or his clothes or his very New Jersey approach to things. But he has mysterious powers. He has mysterious and wonderful powers, and you should be aware of that. Michael Wolff, by the way, says that Trump does not read anything and never has.
No, I agree. Well, Michael's a good friend, and I agree with him.
Does Trump have mysterious powers?
Yes, he does.
What are they?
Well, let me preface my assent to that proposition by saying that he doesn't have mysterious powers which you need to admire. I mean, they are mysterious powers that we need to worry about. What he has is he has weaponized ignorance of norms and precedent, and also made very guileful use of his knowledge of television and latterly social media. He's all instinct. I mean, he has 400 pounds of instinct. He's an id. He's not a strategist. He's not a thinker. What he has is a kind of capacity to hear through the airwaves of America the sources of resentment that he can exploit. And also he is a master of attributing blame and comedy. So a good case study was last year during the campaign, he embarked on this absolutely crazy campaign claiming that these poor old Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, were eating cats and dogs, which was a lie. It was one of those social media things that had turned from mistaken identity and incident into a meme, and before you knew it, it was being claimed. And he said it in a debate. And of course, it was ludicrous, but it stuck in people's minds. And so when he said it at the debate, it went viral online, it was set to music, everyone was talking about it. And of course, we all, I plead guilty to this because I was saying, this is terrible, it's a nightmare, what is he talking about? But everyone in the whole world, everyone was talking about how. What that did was it absolutely cemented migration and the border as the issue in the run up to polling day. I mean, Kamala Harris destroyed him in the debate on any conventional analysis, but he won it in the hypermodern sense that he managed to get out the thing, the germ that escaped from the lab, as it were, was this idea that in some strange way it was all about migration. And that is his genius, which is to use comedy and entertainment and absurdity as a means of making people think, or even by a process of osmosis, just feel certain things about certain aspects of the way they live. And he offers very little, in fact. I mean, it's interesting that if you listen to Trump, he very rarely offers you, he says everything's going to be great again, but the specifics are very rarely that great. What he deals with is scarcity. His idea is we live in a world of scarce resources. It's a zero-sum game. You don't want all these brown people taking it. I'm going to stop them taking it from you. It's a hideous way of approaching the problems of today's world, but it is unfortunately against the old school democratic alternative extremely effective.
And is Boris Johnson, by line of descent, or whatever we call it, was he Trump's intended successor here? Was he mini-Trump?
There are definite symmetries. Boris Johnson certainly had read and reads many books, and indeed has written them and not had them ghostwritten. So that's a big sort of step forward.
Yes.
The similarity was that his entire political style was based on charisma and personality rather than any particular ideology. And that was one of the reasons that he and Dominic Cummings fell out, because Cummings did have an ideology. You know, he wanted to transform the way government worked. And Boris Johnson just wanted to be in number 10 and be in charge. So he wasn't entirely like Trump, and also he had a very different view of Ukraine and other things. But he's certainly in the same, ballpark of how politics is practiced now. Javier Milei in Argentina is another with his chainsaw. These are politicians that rely greatly upon sort of popular spectacle.
As you will know, in mainstream American media, they describe Elon Musk and his chainsaw as being attributable to horse tranquilizers. Absolutely everyone says it. People are rather more cautious about this description, this alleged description of Elon Musk's personal development. But in America, it's every platform, every YouTube thing talks about it.
Well, I think you only have to look at him, look at his eyes, look at his face to realize that he is physically and mentally unwell. I mean, he has admitted to extensive ketamine use. And I think the Wall Street Journal, which is hardly a wild and crazy left-wing title, did a pretty good deep dive on his use of prescription medication. And we know how, careful titles like that are on sourcing. I mean, my sense is that his extraordinary sort of attitude to sleeping in the office and working 24 hours a day, that alone suggests a very unhealthy use of prescription medication. And of course, one of the things that we've learned from people like Michael Jackson is that when you reach a certain level of wealth and celebrity, your doctor is not someone you go to who says, look, maybe you should stop doing this incredibly unhealthy thing. Your doctor is someone who's part of your entourage, an employee, who says, what do you want? What do
you want?
Is this a sommelier of the medicine cupboard? And so I don't know about Elon Musk's doctors, but I would be absolutely astonished if in his entourage there is not a board certified clinician who can sign him off on anything, and probably more than one. So he gets oddly emotional in interviews, and then the deranged posting against Trump, followed by the remorseful apologies and so on. There's a kind of oscillation between euphoria and deep regret that does not look like a healthy man to me. But you're right, people are very careful what they say about him. I'm not really persuaded of the need to do that, in the sense that when you have a situation which we had until they fell apart, where the most powerful country in the history of the world was being run by Trump, about whom we've spoken, and at minimum a ketamine-addled toddler with an interest in technology and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, we're richly entitled to question what's going on, and I think we should, and I think we should dig deep. And I think a lot of people, it took them a while to realize this was real, and Musk's Doge nonsense has been abject failure according to its official terms of reference, which was to save $2 trillion from the federal budget. Well, it was never going to do that. But again, to use a word we used earlier, it has administered a traumatic shock to the administrative state in America, and made it a lot of people who just work perfectly respectably and normally in government in America at all levels feel deeply frightened, and a lot of them are taking early retirement and voluntary redundancy and so on. And that I think, in a way, was always its real purpose, was the idea that these shock troops with laptops would rush into your department, tear through your database. God knows what he's doing with the data, by the way, and then recommend that you will be fired. And the money he's saved is in the scheme of American spending chicken feed, but the shutting down of USAID has already led, without question, to many deaths. These are not unconsequential acts. They really aren't.
What about the other line of dissent? From Doge to the alleged council level mini Doge that reform is promising. Is reform in direct line of succession from all those Americans?
Well, again, there's a question of scale, because reform, I think, controls 11 councils, and the power of local government in this country is quite small. We're not a devolved country, really. We are to the nations to a certain extent. But again, I think that's performative. It's Farage saying reform is different, because his challenge between now and the election is to show in every conceivable respect that he's ahead of Starmer in the curve, whatever we mean by that. So, he'll say, I was ahead of Starmer on grooming gangs. I understood in a way that Starmer didn't, that we needed to actively look for efficiency gains and cut waste. And most of this will be nonsense. But again, Farage has learned from Trump, and to a certain extent deduced himself, is that because he has willing platforms, he has his own show, and newspapers that will report anything he says, this message will get into and is getting into the bloodstream. So, no, I don't think that these reform doges are going to transform local government, far from it. But I think that they will play a part in the campaign that has really already started for the next election.
So, given that the old UK politics is useless and bad things are happening and people are telling lots and lots of post-truth lies, will you lead the charge?
No, I am definitely a hack to the day I die.
Yep.
Yeah, I am. Yeah. I am. I mean, I've had invitations to take part in various capacities, and I'm very honoured so to have been. But what I like to do is to be able to roam across the landscape, as do you, Peter. I mean, I'd be terrible at having to submit to a party whip, for example. I would hate that, because the joy of being a journalist all these years has precisely been the ability to change my mind, on certain things, and to, I hope, if not mature, then certainly to mutate, evolve. That's a thinking life, and I admire politicians. I'm not one of those people who thinks politicians are all terrible people at all. But I realized very early on, as a lot of people I knew socially were starting to go into politics in both parties, I never once felt a sort of stab of envy, because, first of all, I think it's a noble thing to do in many respects. I mean, some of the people do it who really do it because they believe in public service. But the chances of success, and I don't just mean getting elected, but the chances of actually getting anything done are very, very slim. And the cost at the end is huge. I mean, you just have to look at the grey hair of prime ministers and presidents when they emerge from office compared to when they went in to see. I think Bill Clinton calls it cellular damage. It's a very evocative way of describing it. Anyway, so it's not for me. And also because I believe in what we do. I think people who write and podcast and do books, and we need more of that. And the media is not high in public trust, but I think it's important that we carry on and double down, actually.
And when you revisit your old journalistic homes, the Times, the Sunday Telegraph, the Spectator, and the Guardian, yes. I'm not including Tortoise in this because it's such a different entity, born of a different time.
Yeah, but it was important. I mean, that was very valuable because I enjoyed the startup atmosphere, which has now, of course, become The Observer. So that's interesting.
Yes. Carol Cadwallader, who was my last.
Yes, she has strong views.
Has strong views on the matter of Tortoise and The Observer and all that. But the Sunday Telegraph, where you used to work, I don't know who was editor of it when you were working.
Dominic Lawson and then Sarah Sands.
Dominic Lawson, who lives around the corner here in SW1, I can quite imagine, so to speak. Sarah Sands, I can quite imagine. Bright Blue.
They were both excellent editors. Yeah, and they were both, and I worked for Sarah when she edited The Standard too, so that's very pleasant memories on both.
Yeah. But the Sunday Telegraph, now edited by Alistair, S-T-E-R.
Yes.
Spelled S-T-E-R, Alistair Heath, who says some very particular things, doesn't he?
He does.
Great Liz Truss fan.
Well, I have a proprietary interest in Alistair because he was an associate editor at The Spectator when I was editor. Very young, very bright. To be fair to Alistair, he's not opportunistic at all. He's always believed in ultra low tax, ultra small government, ultra low regulation. And he is not a malign person at all. He's an extremely decent man.
But ultra, very ultra.
Yes, he is. But I think that I'm a pluralist, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, when people ask me, what do you think of the Sunday Telegraph now? Well, in a sense, it doesn't really matter, because when I was at the Sunday Telegraph, it was between 1995 and then I went off to the Spectator end of 2005. It couldn't be more different. It's a different time. Now, is the media more polarized? 100%. Okay. Do I agree with what Alistair writes? No. But I'm nervous always of the idea that the solution to the quandary that we all find ourselves in is to focus on the more literate and able spokespeople of the opposite view. In other words, Alistair was always going to be writing this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And actually, there was a very interesting dialogue between Alistair and Jeremy Hunt the other day, which I thought was an excellent idea to do. The question that the Conservatives need to do in particular is, okay, well, what's your answer to that? Because at the moment, you've got the Labour Party, which is struggling badly, but has a huge majority. You've got Reform, which has a tiny number of parliamentary seats, but bestrides the political scene disproportionately and culturally, and a Conservative Party that is completely irrelevant. And I think that, in a way, Alistair's writing is a reproach to that party and, an invitation to them to sort of respond and not just say we'll come up with some ideas nearer the election, but go back to the late 70s. The Conservative Party at one point was the movement was full of ideas, One Nation ideas, Thatcherite ideas. It was a big dialogue. That has gone very quiet. And I think that's an incredibly unhealthy thing in this country because, the Conservative Party at the moment is just nowhere. It's not even on the map. And that's not good because you want as many electoral parties around as you can. I mean, the idea that sort of there's a slow death of the Labour Party which leads to some sort of, surge in reform, perhaps some sort of unholy alliance coalition, that's not a happy prospect. And there are still a few good Conservatives around, and I hope they kind of, raise their game.
But in that broad church which you described, and I sort of remember from a time when I wasn't remotely interested in politics, but I would meet people who were 80s clever Tories who spoke in good faith.
Yes.
In response to whatever idiotic question I asked them. And
that's the point.
I wish I could go back there and talk to those people some more. However, that broad church didn't, it seemed to me, include so many very unpleasant people.
Well, one of the reasons for that is that social media, it has done precisely the opposite of what it was meant to do. So I remember when I was starting to edit The Spectator, it was in the middle of what was then called Web 2.0. And it's about as hippie-ish as I've ever been in my worldview, which was that technology, I remember going to Google conferences and things, and the sell was, now that broadband's here, and now that devices like the iPhone and the iPad are on their way, we're going to unite the world, tyrannies are going to fall, there's going to be dissent, smart mobs, everyone is going to speak to one another, and it will be a glorious Babel of dissent and pluralism, right? Whereas actually what happened was that we invented machines to hate each other very, in real time. And it has had a terrible effect upon the public space. There's no point you can't uninvent it, and you can't even solve it by going to blue sky. The problem is that it's just there, and it has a massive impact. You just have to buy into it. But you're right. I mean, the good faith aspect of politics has declined massively, as has the sort of principle of charity, the idea that you assume that the other side comes from a good place until you're persuaded otherwise. You don't get that anymore.
No.
That's gone. That's gone.
Who invented that wonderful term, I think in the early 1960s, the theatre of cruelty?
That's a very good question.
Because that is, people used to say, oh, do you know, you hold certain kinds of Americans, certain kinds of conservative Brits say you hold your nose and you vote for Trump.
Yes.
Whereas it seems to me that people like the cruelty. They like pushing a lot of half-naked South Americans.
Yes, I agree.
Hobbled and with their hands clamped together, while that lady stands outside.
Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security. Yeah, I mean, the best book on this is by the Atlantic journalist Adam Serwer, who wrote a book based on various articles he'd written for the Atlantic called The Cruelty is the Point. And that was based on the first Trump term, and it's all the more germane now. But it is true that, neuroscientists, I'm sure, would have lots to tell us about this, which is that there are parts of the brain which are attuned to trigger instincts of compassion and generosity and fellow feeling and community. And there are parts of the brain which are sadistic and cruel and enjoy conflict and enjoy conquest and destruction. And unfortunately, the latter is more prominent in public life at the moment than the former. But they've always been there, both of them. They're part of the human and neuro makeup, and they are being triggered to a different extent at the moment. I mean, it's interesting if you go back and look at, the way that people responded to the New Deal in the 30s, or to early JFK, or even, for all its cosmetic qualities, to Blair's New Labour. There was a generosity of spirit, however superficial. It is there in the human makeup. I don't think it goes away because it's part of evolutionary psychology, but it is not being, it's rarely triggered these days, should we say.
Well, I think you've got very considerable generosity of spirit, much more than me.
Oh, thank you.
Much more than me, I can say. You can find a place in your heart, even for Piers Morgan, which is, to me, unutterably amazing. But...
Well, he says, I like him. This is, I suppose it's just one of those things. I do like the guy.
He can be very entertaining, but there you are. Now, it seems to me that you know everything and read and write all day. What do you like when you're not doing all that? What is fun for you?
Well, I'm sort of a believer in the Noel Coward line.
Work is more fun than fun.
Work is more fun than fun, yeah. And also in the sense that it's been, the great privilege of my career, and especially in the last 10 or 15 years, to be able to write about things that I like doing anyway. Yep. So I write a weekly culture newsletter for the New World, which, it means that all the things that you asked me what my main passions are, I love to read, and I also... I'm obsessed by movies. I mean, really, I'd much prefer to have been a movie director than a journalist, but, I don't think I'd have been very good. But anyway, I love going to the movies. So I'm able not only to go to the movies, but to write about it, which is heaven. So that's my idea of fun, and all the usual things. I'm hanging out with my sons, my friends. I mean, nothing that would really surprise you. When I sort it out, my secret advice is that I really like Wagner. So I've been to Bayreuth a few times, and that's always an absolute blast. But there you go.
If I find it, I will photograph and send you my great-grandmother's Wagner autograph in her autograph book.
Oh, my goodness.
Isn't that delicious?
How amazing.
You know,
Oh, please do.
there she got it. I mean, she obviously was wandering wherever it was.
Yes.
Somewhere German.
And there he was.
And there he was. I can't explain it, and I can't find it at the moment.
Well, I admire her greatly because from the biographies I've written, he wasn't necessarily the most easily approachable guy in the world.
Well, who knows? Do you think she made it up herself?
No. I don't
think so.
I don't think so. I think that's wonderful. What a great thing.
Well, for me, I like things.
Yes.
I'm very, very simple-mindedly materialistic. I like a nice thing. I like a nice object. I like a nice picture. I like a nice pair of shoes. I like wandering down Jermyn Street and seeing what I haven't got, you know.
Oh, but that's terribly important. So there's no such thing as just things. I mean, the physical and material culture in which we live is really, 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 really important. And it matters more than I think a lot of public intellectuals are prepared to admit. It really does, because it shows not only what's shaping us, but how we're shaping the world. And the gap between mass production and bespoke production is one that I don't know much about, but I always find very interesting.
And when I see you next, I shall explain how I, not single-handedly, double-handedly, with a friend, ruined the British film industry of the 1980s. Just like that. It's a great story. You'll love it. It's terrible.
That's what I call a teaser trailer.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much for joining me.
Thank you, Peter. It's always a pleasure to see you, and thank you for inviting me on this august podcast.
Thank you so much, Matthew d'Ancona. Now, in the next episode of my podcast, I'll be talking to someone very special to be revealed shortly. Peter York's Culture Wars House Party is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.